welcome to The Art of Adventure. This is a paternity leave series episode. I've got a newborn baby at home, and so I'm taking a short break from recording new episodes of The Art of Adventure, and it gives me a perfect chance to shine the light on some of my other favorite podcasts. And Jordan Harbinger of The Jordan Harbinger Show has agreed to share one of his episodes with us here on The Art of Adventure. And Jordan recently was recognized with the Best New Podcast of 2018 award. So he's a really good interviewer. He's been a guest here on The Art of Adventure a couple of times and is just really amazing at building rapport with his guests to get the best stories from them. So in this interview, it's super adventurous. Jordan interviews Michael Scott Moore, who's a journalist who was captured and held by Somali pirates for more than 2 years. And Jordan has actually been captured and held hostage twice in his life. And so I think he does a great job of exploring how someone keeps their sanity while they're being captive. They cover, why pirating is still a thing. Why are there Somali pirates? It's 2018. And how these highly religious pirates reconcile their actions with their faith. So super interesting and adventurous episode. And I will be back with fresh new episodes of The Art of Adventure for you in January 2019. So for today, please enjoy this episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show, all about the Somali pirates.
So tell us why are there pirates now, and why are they in Somalia? It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. This is a nation that doesn't even have a navy, so how are they basically going and hijacking boats? It seems unusual. If there were going to be pirates, I would have expected maybe like, hey, the Dutch economy is pretty slow. They're hijacking boats now.
Yeah, no, they don't have a navy, and that's one reason they do have pirates, as a matter of fact, because when the last sort of stable but also dictatorial government collapsed in Somalia in 1991, there stopped being these national organizations, including a navy. I mean, the national military was barely existent, So there was no navy to defend the coastline, and starting in the 90s, international fishing outfits figured that out, and they came close to the Somali coast and started stealing their fish. So the roots of Somali piracy are in this illegal fishing. And in those first years in the 90s, before any of us heard about Somali piracy, there were local leaders, clan leaders, that would send out armed men on little boats to stop the fishing ships and say, do you have a license? And they would say no. And then they would detain the ship for maybe 24 hours and charge the owners maybe $50,000. And that would be the license fee, right? And then fishing went on as usual. So although the Somalis had no central national government, they acted as if they did. And they sent out these armed men to sort of take care of the... And it worked. It was not an ideal arrangement, but that's how things worked off Somalia in the 90s. And because it worked in some half-assed way, we never heard about it, until about 2005, when some of these gangs got more organized and more ambitious and started to capture large merchant ships, so tankers and cargo ships and things like that. And even after they started taking these crews hostage, the pirates insisted that they were still defending their coastline. And it became such a profitable business that starting in 2005, but all the way up until 2012 or so, pirates were a real problem off Somalia. And that's when I went there. I wanted to learn, what was going on, not just in the world, but also in Somalia itself. That saw the resurgence of pirates in a big way in this particular corner of the world, because we had gone more than 2 centuries without piracy on the high seas in a really large, important way. There have always been pirates, but we squelched pirates. I mean, the American Navy did, and set up a whole new order on the planet's oceans that seemed to be falling apart when the Somalis sort of raised their heads.
Yeah, this kind of throwback crime, if you will, is highly unusual. You hear about it in the South China Sea and you think, well, okay, South China Sea just sounds like a sketchy place where there would be pirates, so fine, and the way I envision those are kind of like people who live in fishing villages in the Philippines are like, hey, I can go steal this tugboat or something, or I can go extort this crew. Pretty small scale. There's insurance for it. Most of the ships are probably locals going after other near locals or at least regional powers. But then you see Somalia and it's like, oh, let's run over and get this giant Dutch or American or whatever oil tanker with hundreds of people on it.
Exactly.
And tow it in.
And then keep them for a really long time. I mean, that's what became sort of characteristic of Somali piracy, is how long they held onto the ships and the crews. There was some piracy in another very important shipping lane off Indonesia in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that was also related to local unrest. So it tends to be groups who need money for some sort of civil war. In Aceh in Indonesia, the rebels there against the central government were also sending out pirates to make some money. But, it was a smallish thing. It was not an identifiable era like the Somali pirate era. And the last identifiable era would have been, the Barbary Coast era, which lasted for several centuries off what's now Morocco. So all this was really interesting to me. Now, you have to say there are pirates in other places too. Off West Africa, it's a problem, and off Venezuela. So it's almost as if the Somalis gave other people ideas.
Ah, interesting. So essentially, wherever there's no strong government, the Navy tends to, it's expensive to run, probably. And they say, you know what, we got enough we got people throwing Molotov cocktails in the streets of the capital. We don't need to be sailing around protecting some American boat from being attacked. Least of our worries.
Yes, I think off West Africa, off Nigeria normally, and Venezuela, it's tied in with organized crime. So organized criminals have figured out a way to make it profitable to go and sack other ships. I think the lack of a navy to keep order in both places is important, but it's not as obvious a source of the problem as it was in Somalia. It's interesting. It becomes an organized crime really quickly because the groups have to be organized. It's just interesting how quickly the idea has spread a little bit. And I think it's symptomatic of a breakdown in international order. And I wish I could quite put my finger on it.
I can see this, and I can understand it. When you live in Somalia, you don't have a central government, or at least not a functioning government. You're in a failed state. Terrorism, piracy, it might be one of the better options for upward mobility for somebody with a zero education or even a couple years of basic education. Possibly these guys, and the way you describe them in the book, and we'll get into this in a little bit, is that they're idiots generally. They're not, I'm not just being rude. Like, these guys seem really dumb. Mm-hmm. They're not just rural. They're not just uneducated. They're actually just kind of these bumbling fools in a lot of ways. Not all of them, of course, but this is not a situation where they say, let me just be a farmer. I'll take my goods to market. I'll have fair trade. These are people that exist in this chaotic, lawless state with terrorism, Boko Haram on one side, foreign governments on the other, the local government, and they're just trying to get by, but they become less sympathetic as they do more and more things that are just kind of downright evil.
Yeah, so it's a chaotic situation. I mean, so first of all, Boko Haram is over in West Africa, but they have Al-Shabaab in
that's what I meant to say.
Somalia,
yeah, Al-Shabaab,
which is the sort of Al-Qaeda franchise there. And actually, Al-Shabaab and pirate gangs are the two big corporate structures for a young man with no education and maybe some weapons training to consider. So that's what's interesting. I think this whole excuse that pirates use, that they're defending the coastline and they're frustrated former fishermen, that tends to be propaganda. What is true is that these guys have no prospects. They've got very few jobs. And when they look at these organized criminal organizations, which is also what Al-Shabaab is, they look at almost a corporate structure where a young man can, move up. And that's what, we take that for granted in the West. But in Somalia, that's very tempting to a young man. I would say that a lot of young Somalis join Al-Shabaab also for that reason and not just out of ideology.
Well, first of all, I want to point out that when I was in fourth grade, I told my fourth grade teacher that pirates still existed. This is in the 90s. And the whole class laughed at me, and the teacher laughed at me and said pirates don't exist anymore. But my uncle Dave, he worked for Chevron for a long time, and he told me about people trying to climb up on tanker ships, and the crew would be shooting them off with the high-powered water hoses and stuff like that.
Yeah, and you were right. I mean, in that sense, they've never Pirates have never gone away, but it's what I was interested in was the phenomenon of a regional of a region where it was actually dangerous to sail. And so there are actually a lot of parallels between Somalia and the Barbary Coast from a couple of centuries ago.
Now, you're in Somalia trying to track down pirate gangs for a piece, and you start talking about the rumor kitchen. And I'd love to kind of hear what this felt like. You're in this lawless place eating terrible / mediocre food for like $600 a meal because everyone's just kind of extorting you guys from the sound of it, and is part of the cost of doing business down there.
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly didn't spend $600 on every meal. We went with a big security team, and we paid the security team a lot of money, and it was this one portion of a clan in central Somalia that was supposed to protect us. And when they took us out to the coast, another clan that was more sympathetic to the pirates sort of hosted us, and hosted their clan people, their clan relatives from that were protecting us. And so we had a big feast, and the bill for that feast turned out to be something like $600, one feast, right? And that seemed outrageous to our guards. And my partner Ashwin and I paid very close attention to that little incident, because we knew that a dispute about money could become very dangerous for us very quickly. It did seem a little bit showy to me, and I described that in The Desert and the Sea, but it seemed to fizzle. Our people didn't make a huge issue about it. So only one meal for $600, and that was covered by our security people. But I should say that I wasn't just sort of casting around for stories. I was also looking for background on a trial that I had covered in Germany. So I had spent about a year covering a trial of 10 pirates in Hamburg who got caught trying to capture a German cargo ship. I sort of knew what I was doing.
Right. Yeah. And then you start, it's interesting, in The Desert and the Sea, you start saying things like, so I was looking around, people were looking at us, people started to talk about us, people knew who we were before we got there. And you kind of got this little hint, maybe it's 2020 hindsight, I would imagine. You kind of got this little hint of, how does everybody know what we're doing here?
Yeah.
And it seems like it would make sense. Probably not a whole lot going on down there in rural Somalia, but it started to make you nervous.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk, and that's what the chapter, the rumor kitchen, refers to. It's from a German phrase, which just means the rumor mill. Another word for it would be the bush telegraph. I mean, word got around fast that strangers were in the region. It's a very closed area, so it's always been closed to outsiders, which means that word gets around when outsiders are there. I was traveling with another journalist who's Indian born, and it didn't matter. Both of us looked like outsiders.
So how did they get you? Where did it go from, I'm eating bad, mediocre, stewed goat head, to, oh crap, I'm chained to a mattress?
Well, that happened in stages. But yeah, my partner Ashwin flew off to Mogadishu, and since it seemed wiser to stick together, we had one group of guards. I drove him to the airport, and then we saw him off. He got on the plane safely, and then on the way back from the airport, back into town towards our hotel, there was actually a truck waiting for us. It was a truck with a cannon welded in the back, an anti-aircraft cannon. These are very common trucks. They're called technicals because of the civil war in Somalia. And at first we thought it was there to watch over us or protect us or something. But actually it stopped our car, and 12 gunmen from the flatbed came over to my side of the car, and they actually fired in the air and then opened the door and tore me out of the car. So they were waiting for me, and they were probably waiting or hoping for both of us. I think they were a little bit disappointed that there was only one journalist. But no, they pulled me out of the car. They beat me. They broke my glasses. I was wearing glasses at the time, and they had another car waiting, and they sort of bundled me into it, and off we drove into the bush. And after that, I was a hostage.
I can't imagine what was going through your head at that particular time. What were you thinking right then? Were you thinking like, okay, I'm going to get out of this, or I'm going to fight these guys off? Tell us sort of the play-by-play here, because I would imagine in the beginning you're like, this isn't happening.
Yeah. No, I mean, I knew it was bad, but at first I describe in the Desert and the Sea that my mind actually recoiled from what was going on. I mean, I actually saw myself in the process of denial, because at first, like I said, I thought they were there to protect us. I thought it was a friendly technical. When it was clear that they wanted something from us, I thought, oh, well, it's a traffic stop, or that happens at random sometimes in Somalia. They just want to see our papers, no problem. But it was obvious they wanted more than papers. And once it was really underway, the first thing I thought was how horrible it was going to be for my family, because, I didn't want my own adventures in difficult parts of the world to have an effect on my family. And of course, once I was captured, it did. I mean, my mother had to think about it every day for the next 2 years and 8 months.
Oh my gosh. No kids. No
kids. Yeah,
not married. Okay. That's kind of cold comfort, but at least then you weren't worrying about some kids growing up without you or exactly. Whatever, not going to go to college because they spent it on your ransom.
Yeah.
So who are you with? Where are you? Where do they take you?
They drove me into the bush for about 3 hours, something like that. Hard to keep track of time, but they drove me to a bush camp. And at some point we stopped. They blindfolded me and they took me a few steps over to a mattress. So there was a mattress waiting for me in the middle of nowhere. There were other people there, other guards and other hostages, and I sat down, and then I was a hostage. One of the guards gave me some food, some bottled water and some bread and some canned tuna, and that was it. I mean, over the next couple of days, I got to know the other two hostages, and they became very important to me. But at first, obviously, I had no idea where I was or what was going to happen. I mean, I had to use clues, including the direction of that the sun was setting in, to guess which clan region I was in and to guess which people were holding me, because of course the pirates weren't going to tell me that. But slowly it was clear that the pirates holding me belonged to the same clan as the pirates that were supposed to have protected me.
So they essentially sold you out, probably.
Yeah, sorry, the guards that were supposed to have protected me.
Right.
The clan that hosted me, essentially, somebody betrayed me. Someone sold me out to pirate members of the same clan.
Jeez. So you can't even hire local protection because they might just say, hey, look.
They might turn, yeah.
Yeah, there's more in it if we just lock you to this tree or whatever.
So they thought.
Yeah. So they thought. Okay. And so there's other hostages there. Did they take those guys from boats? Were they taken from land? I'm curious who these other guys are.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. They were both fishermen. They were both poor fishermen from the Seychelles, which is an island country off the coast of West Africa, an African country. But once they were captured, since they spoke a kind of French Creole, the pirates were happy to assume that they were from France.
Oh my God.
Or from Australia. I mean, they just came up with wild ideas because obviously they wanted to demand a lot more money than they were going to get from some African country. But these two guys were very poor, independent fishermen who were working, cleaning fish at night on a small boat about 50 miles outside their home port, hundreds of miles away from Somalia. And at night, a couple of boats of pirates came up and took over their ship, over their boat, and forced them to sail back to Somalia. It took a full week. But one of them, the skipper of that boat, his name's Roli Tambara, he became sort of my partner in suffering for the next several months. For some reason, the pirates put the two of us together and separated the two Seychellois.
So do you speak French? How were you talking to these guys?
Yeah, I speak a little bit of French, but we spoke English. He also speaks broken English, and no, we got along quite well.
You mentioned that you started to speak maritime-sounding English at some points. What does that even mean? So before I figured out where he was from, I heard his English now and then, and I thought, well, that sounds like island English somehow. You know how the English that you hear maybe in Jamaica has kind of an island sound. It has a maritime sound because that's the history of Jamaica. So I thought, well, there's something about the way this guy talks that makes me think he's from an island somewhere, but I couldn't quite place it until he told me his name, and I've sort of located exactly where he was from. I narrowed it down, in other words, to the Comoros or the Seychelles before he finally told me. It's funny. Rolly's a chatterbox, but in the first few days he didn't want to say anything because he was afraid of punishment by the pirates. And these pirates, your captors, I mentioned this before. They're kind of stupid. They're just high all the time on khat. Can you tell us what that is? What is going on there? They're chewing this leaf all the time.
Yeah, khat is a little like cocoa leaf. It's actually a narcotic leaf, but it makes you high at first and very nervous and agitated. It's kind of a hopped up high, and then
sounds awesome.
Awesome, right? And then when you come down, this is the narcotic aspect. All you want to do is sleep, and then you wake up in the morning and you're depressed and you need more cut. So one pirate, I never met a single pirate who wasn't addicted to it. It's a very expensive addiction, actually. And one pirate said cut is the Somali beer, and by that he meant Muslims don't drink alcohol. So this is like this sort of easy stuff to get high on that's not alcohol.
Oh my gosh. Talk about, and that's just one of many points at which the hypocrisy of what these guys were doing, because they're like, we're religious, we can't eat pork, and it's like, but you can kidnap people, beat them up, get high on cots, all this dumb crap. And then they were like, the point at one point they're giving you a bottle of alcohol and everybody wants a sip of it.
Yeah, exactly. The one pirate boss, so the low-level guards, they were strangely devout, Sufi Muslims. And the bosses, they didn't even pretend. So one boss actually drank, I think, gin and gave me a bottle at some point, presumably because negotiations were going well. But I don't know actually why he gave me a bottle. And the pirates just expected me to sort of empty it in one glug, but I hung onto it for a few days, and they were just sort of electrified by the sight of a bottle of alcohol in the room. So some of them wanted a taste, and some of them were like, no, I'm Muslim.
Right, I'm Muslim. I can only torture people and kidnap them from boats, but. God forbid I should have a sip of this. Yeah.
I can only kidnap infidels.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or other people that are the wrong kind of Muslim. I mean, it's just...
The wrong kind of Muslim, yeah. They did have justifications. I mean, they did try and work piracy into their religion, which I found really interesting. One thing is that most Somalis who are not al-Shabaab, who are not the fundamentalist al-Qaeda type, they find nothing wrong with chewing khat. But my pirates also found excuses in the Quran to kidnap infidels. So I talked about him because I was concerned about, for his spiritual welfare, or at least that's what I said. And he gave me a very clear but still not very devout reason, that seemed to be in line with his notion of Islam.
Do you remember what that is? I'm curious.
Yeah, I said, Bashko, there was one guard I spoke to easily because he had a good sense of humor, even though he didn't have much English and I didn't have much Somali. But I said, Bashko, you pray all the time, you're a Muslim. He's like, yeah. I said, but you're also a thief. These things don't go together. And he found that quite funny because it was obviously, I think I pricked his conscience. At first he laughed, and then eventually he started to give me excuses. And we came back to the topic for over and over for a couple of weeks. And then finally he broke down and gave me what I think he considered the real reason. And he said, the Quran says to struggle with the infidel. And because we're not al-Shabaab, we're not going to shoot you for that reason. But we do think it's okay to take your money. He said, stealing from an infidel isn't theft.
Yeah. And it's like, well, if that was the reason, how come it took you 3 weeks to come up with it? Right.
Yeah. He didn't quite want to say that to me, but I wasn't buying his other reasons. So
yeah. What are you eating at this point? Because the food in the book, In the Desert and the Sea, it sounds pretty gross. And even before you became a prisoner, it sounded pretty gross. Flies everywhere, everything's greasy. It just, it's like the opposite of anything I've ever thought appetizing.
Yeah. One thing that was good in Somalia was camel meat. I was surprised by that, but I didn't mind camel. The thing that wasn't good was goat, and I got goat more than any other kind of meat because they didn't flavor it. They just sort of boiled it and handed it over to me on a pile of pasta. But actually, I had a lot of pasta that had nothing on it, just boiled spaghetti, which they've inherited from their colonial era under the Italians, and sometimes canned tuna, which I don't ever have to eat in my life again. and beans, but not beans with salt or anything like that, but beans with sugar.
Oh,
so, yeah, it was kind of disgusting.
Yeah. I mean, it's just you go from eating greasy goat parts during the phase where you're researching the story to eating greasy goat parts that other people who actually enjoy eating greasy goat parts don't really want to eat because now you're a prisoner and they're like, here's a part of the greasy goat that I don't even want. have
Exactly.
this on your raw pot or your undercooked boiled spaghetti.
Yeah, like thank you. Yeah.
Was there anything that was? Do you ever draw the line where you're just like, look, I'm not eating this. This is disgusting. It was like, what was the nastiest thing that they had over there?
The nastiest thing. That's a good question.
Aside from being kidnapped by Somali pirates, the food wise though, what's the nastiest thing?
So this isn't in the book, but at one point the guards actually decapitated a pigeon. They killed a pigeon that had gotten caught in the house. I don't know why they did that, and I don't know if they cooked it, but I certainly didn't eat any meat in the few days after that. I think they might have been hoping to cook it for themselves. But I actually quit eating so much pasta. They kept handing me these piles of boiled pasta with very little on it, and I said, no, just give me whatever you're drizzling on it, so the boiled potatoes and some flavor. I'll just take that in a dish. I don't need pasta every day because I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't very hungry. And they got worried about my health. So after a long time of not eating pasta, they came up with something. They decided to feed me a kind of pancake, which you and I might know from Ethiopian restaurants. So they called it anjero, and it was really just like a crepe, but the proper anjero is made with a certain kind of grain, which I don't think the Somalis had at that point.
Wow. Okay. So they're feeding you. You basically went on the low carb diet because you weren't doing anything.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I for somebody who doesn't eat a lot of that stuff, that would just be so annoying to get this nutritionless starch crap every day.
Yeah, that got on my nerves. But
did you lose weight?
Oh yeah, no, I lost 45 pounds in the first few months, I think.
Oh my gosh. Were you sick or were you just
No, that was just the sudden change in diet. Afterwards, I did get sick. I had malaria sometime late in the first year. And then towards the end of my captivity entirely, I started to have immune system problems. So I had, little infections here and there in my skin and my ear and things like that.
Well, the pirate diet's not helping either with all that.
No, it was the problem, actually.
Yeah. So okay, they're keeping you for a while. When do you start to figure out you're not going to leave in a week or whatever? Or are you thinking, look, I'm ready to get out of here anytime. This is temporary. Just kind of relax, keep it together.
Yeah, no, there was no relaxing, but I think in the first week or two, I had this irrational hope that it would somehow resolve itself quickly. In stages that went away. And the one moment when I realized I was going to be there for quite a bit longer was when they decided to quit running from surveillance planes on land, which we did for the first 2 or 3 months. And they put me and Rolly, one of the other Seychellois fishermen, on board a ship. It was a tuna vessel that another part of the pirate gang had captured on the open ocean, and they had it anchored near Hobyo. And in mid-April in 2012, Rolly and I were taken aboard. They loaded us into a pirate skiff and buzzed us out to the ship. And so we spent about 5 or 6 months over the summer of 2012 on this hijacked vessel.
Oh, wow. So they're using the hijacked boats like prisons, essentially.
Yeah, it was definitely a prison ship. There were already 28 hostages on board, the crew of the ship. And the pirates, when they captured it, had killed the captain. So the captain was frozen in the deep freeze with the tuna.
Oh my gosh! Why did they freeze the body? I remember they shot the Taiwanese captain, but what's the point? Why don't they just throw the guy overboard? Why are they leaving the guy in the freezer? That's mystifying.
A couple of reasons. I think a burial at sea is not very Muslim, so they didn't want to just do that. And they also held him as long as the freezer worked. Hoping to get money for the body. So I actually know that they made a request of something like $1 million just for the captain's body.
Jeez. Wow.
Yeah, that didn't work, by the way.
No. I mean, if they're going to leave the live crew sitting on a boat in the ocean, they're not going to pay for the dead body of the captain.
Yeah.
Jeez. Now, tell us what it's like to wake up from a dream about, eating In-N-Out Burger, grabbing a coffee, reading the newspaper, and then you wake up, you realize you're on a stinky bare mattress in Somalia held captive by a bunch of third world jackasses.
Well, that happened every night.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't necessarily dream about food, but I did dream about my friends. And it turns out that in the meantime, friends have told me that they dreamt about me. So it's like, in some sense, we met during sleep. But then I would wake up, you know, not after a good night's sleep. I would wake up sometimes 3 times a night and go, oh, geez, I'm still in Somalia.
Ugh.
So that was miserable. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just torture. Did you ever think like, okay, I'm going to jump off this ship and that's it?
Well, I did jump off the ship.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I thought about it almost as soon as I was on the ship because I'm also a surfer, so I can swim, and we were only about a mile from shore. But I knew that it had to be done properly. I mean, something had to be arranged, and sometimes I tried to arrange things, and by communicating over the phone with my mom and that kind of thing. I mean, I knew we were being listened to. But nothing quite worked, and I didn't jump until the anchor chain of the Naham 3, that ship, actually snapped. It was weak anyway, and for some reason at the end of the summer it actually broke. And within 20 minutes of us sort of floating at random downstream, there was a very powerful current along the Somali coast. Once we were sort of anchorless, a surveillance plane actually came to look at us. And I thought, well, somebody mustered that plane really quickly. I'd been seeing that plane for about a month. And I thought, well, if it came over to the ship that quickly for an emergency, then maybe it has some sort of local support, like an aircraft carrier or something. And that night, I also thought, because the anchor chain was gone, we were probably going to get moved ashore pretty quickly. So that night, I knew we were being watched by drones. There's no way that the Navy was not watching the ship because they knew I was on board. So that night, I found an excuse to get down to the open deck in the dark. And my guard, who brought me down, had no gun. And I thought, this is my chance. And I jumped.
How do you know that they knew you were on board? They told you when you got off?
I had mentioned it more than once on the phone in German.
Oh, I see. Right.
The Somalis didn't know. And there were also, there was the one surveillance plane, but there were also drones. So it was clear that we were being watched.
And you said you're trying to sort of signal to these planes. How are you doing that?
The only way I could communicate was every once in a while when the pirates gave me a phone. But on land, I had learned to flash the sky with Morse code because I had bummed a cigarette from a pirate and also sort of palmed his lighter when I realized it was a lighter that had an LED at the end. So whenever I would go out to pee, I would actually aim the lighter at the sky, either at dusk or dawn, when it was sort of half dark, and use a toilet paper roll to contain the flare. And I flashed SOS at the sky, hoping that somebody would notice, And I continued to do that on the ship, which means once I was on the ship, I think they knew where I was. I think because of that flashing, they probably also knew which cabin I was sleeping in. So that I think once I was on the ship, it was actually helpful.
That's interesting. I can imagine at the time you're just racking your brain like, does anyone see this? Because you're not looking at a plane necessarily through this tube. You're just hoping, okay, it's up there, or there's a satellite taking a picture of me right now.
Well, just hoping, yeah, because we're hoping that the schedule, the sort of regular habit would catch somebody's eye, because I only had an opportunity to do it maybe twice a day. Going to the bathroom in the middle of the afternoon, that wouldn't work. But my first piss in the morning and my last piss in the evening, around dawn or dusk, those were opportunities. And I thought, well, if I do this regularly for long enough, somebody will figure it out and come and try and see what's going on.
How long were you on this boat, and how did you keep from going insane?
Well, on the boat, it was okay. On the ship, I had plenty of company. It was a crew of 28 guys from East Asia, and we didn't necessarily speak to each other in the same language, but there was an onboard pidgin, a sort of language that they had cobbled together, so we could communicate a little bit. There were 5 Filipinos who spoke English, and so we had friends. Rolly and I had people we could socialize with, and although it was extremely boring and frustrating, it wasn't solitary confinement. But once I jumped and they brought me onto the shore afterwards, then it was solitary confinement. And that's where I had to actually guard against going insane. Yeah.
So I feel like I would try to learn Somali or try to study a language, that language, something, or my brain would just rust, I think.
Yeah. I did, since a bunch of the sailors spoke Chinese, I did learn a little bit of Chinese on the ship. But on land, I didn't really want to take Somali lessons from my guards. I think I've lived in Berlin, and when East Germans were being educated in what was basically a Russian system and had to learn Russian, some of them rebelled and didn't, and that's kind of how I felt while I was sitting there. There was also very little paper and pen, so it would have just been sort of oral lessons in Somali, and I didn't have the patience for that.
Yeah, especially from a bunch of morons,
From the pirates, yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, so best case scenario, you end up with like a medium command of the dumbest version of that particular language. The one that signals that you learned it from people who can barely or can't even read or write or spell their own name or anything like that. Yeah.
Well, I learned a few crucial words, but just the bare minimum. To sort of express my needs to them. So I know how to say piss in Somali.
Yeah, sure. You said you made a pigeon with the Chinese guys and the other hostages. What does that sound like? How do you do that?
Well, that was a mixture of Chinese and English. Some of the men spoke no English, but knew words like washi wash. So if you doubled a word like washi wash or chum chum, that could mean something to everybody. And washi wash obviously meant laundry or washing your dishes, and chum chum meant food, or it meant eating. Then we had the Chinese word for pirate, which was hai tao. We said hai tao, and a couple other words like loco. I don't know where they learned a Spanish word, but that was what we said for crazy.
So what's a sentence that you would normally use with these guys?
Oh, well, the sentence I mentioned in The Desert and the Sea is very good, because the other word that was important was, for some reason, sasa, S-A, doubled, meant we had plenty of something or too much of something. So if we had lots of water, you could say water sasa. But if you talked about how the pirates just would flap their mouths and not mean anything, which they did, and which came up quite a bit, you would say, hai tao, bow wow, sasa. So bow wow, for some reason, meant gab a lot, meant talk. So.
Oh my gosh. So it's sort of like, it sounds like your company is almost, you're kind of like hanging out with toddler conversations, right?
Yeah, they were pretty rudimentary conversations, even with our friends. But I mean, I really got to know those guys on the crew and really got to like them. So I hope I can see some of them again.
Did you try to signal? You said you tried to signal when you were on the phone with your mom and things like that. I mean, how does that work? Are you saying things like, yeah, Mom, the C-130s fly over every day at 10 a.m. And they're like, okay, there's a C-130 at this place every 10 a.m. He's around here somewhere, right? Or something like this? How do you do that?
No, it didn't work like that. I would come up with landmarks and say, just south of this hill or something like that, and probably east of Hobyo or whatever. But I couldn't always use those words. I certainly couldn't use the word Hobyo, so I would have to say in German, a town that starts with H, although come to think of it, that would have been a little bit confusing in that part of the world. I had to come up with these things before I got on the phone, because phone calls were so nerve-wracking. But I would come up with formulas to sort of indicate where I was and then say them in German. I had to do it in German, otherwise the pirates would have gotten angry.
Sure. I can imagine that. I mean, look, this is just crazy. I've been kidnapped 2 times, but if you count one failed attempt, and I was captive for a day the other time. So not for years at a time. I mean, you were there for over 2.5 years.
When were you kidnapped?
Once when I was 20 in Mexico, the fake taxi type of abduction.
Oh boy. Yeah, right.
And then another time when I was in Serbia, they thought I was a spy, so their state security guys came after me, but they're not like real cops. These are like these dumb militia guys from Bosnia who are like, yeah, we're freedom fighters. And I'm like, no, you're high on meth and it's 7 a.m.
Yeah. And was that the failed one, or did that last for a couple of days?
That one was like a day and a half. Yeah, that one. And that was an escape, because they were just so out of it that eventually they kind of gave me an opportunity, and I was just able to leave the house where I was, because I had seen where I was, and these guys were just high out of their minds.
Good, lucky. Yeah,
lucky. because when I'm reading your book, I'm thinking, oh my God, it's still going. I read the audiobook, so I don't see how much is left in the book. And I just went, oh my God, he's not out yet? I mean, for crying out loud. And I'm sure you felt the same way in real time. Yeah. Oh, I'm getting in a car. And they kept telling you, okay, all right, this is good. You're going to be gone in a few days. And then eventually you're like, okay, this is not happening. None of these guys know what the hell's going on.
And I can't believe them. I can't listen to them when they say that. And they said it a lot. Yeah, they thought they were helping, I think, but they were not helping at all.
Right. It was just it was psychological torture.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, to raise your hope. How did your personality change as you spent more and more time as a hostage? You kind of talk about things like you're getting quick temper, no doubt that's very forgivable, but other weird things happened that I wouldn't have expected.
I was sitting on a lot of anger, and it just got worse, obviously. So I had a quick temper with the guards, which I had to restrain sometimes, and then sometimes I felt murderous. Sometimes I felt murderous, and sometimes I felt suicidal, and so I had to think about it very carefully on occasion whether I just wanted to pick up one of the Kalashnikovs that was lying around on the floor. They weren't very careful about their weapons, and I would have had a chance more than once to pick up a gun and try and blast my way out. But I figured out, and I'm glad I figured out, that would have been a suicidal motion.
I wonder though, when you had the 28 other hostages, why it wasn't. And I know you talked about it with one of the higher ranking hostages.
Yeah.
Did you outnumber the pirates at any point? Because it seems like, man, the boat had fuel on it. The generator was working. You guys knew the ship really well. You could have locked these guys up or just shot them or thrown them over. Half of them couldn't swim. That would have been it.
That certainly crossed my mind. And I mentioned it to one of the Chinese guys who were sort of in charge. He said no, because as a rule, pirates don't kill their hostages. And the other problem with that plan is that we didn't know how many guards were on board. So we were confined to one work deck on a 50-meter ship. The Somalis could go anywhere. So even if we could only see 10 Somalis at one time, we weren't sure that there weren't 30. And actually, my guess is that there was probably one guard for each person, and they were just stashed here and there. I don't know. I don't actually know how many guards were on board. And we had weapons. I mean, we had scaling knives and other sharp things, but we didn't have guns. So it would have, and nobody had, no one on the hostage side of things had any military training, so or very much. So the prospect of actually grabbing weapons and trying to overpower the Somalis was too uncertain. But I certainly thought about it, and I certainly brought it up. But I wouldn't have been the person to lead it. That wouldn't have been possible because I did. 10 of the guys on the ship were Chinese and only spoke Chinese.
Sure. Yeah.
So it would have had to be. They would have had to lead it.
Yeah, I thought about this so many times. I'm having these fantasies essentially for you, and I'm like, look, how would we do this? Okay, when one of them comes into your living area, you grab him, you break his neck or you stab him, and then you throw him overboard at night, and then he's missing, and then they're looking for him, and then you grab another couple, and then eventually there's only like 5 left. I don't know. There was no good plan. There wasn't one. Right?
No, there wasn't. And I actually heard, obviously I thought about this a lot, and I came up with plans and things like that. But I heard about one hostage escape in Mali. A French engineer got away from his Islamist guards in West Africa. And some of the circumstances that were mentioned on the BBC when I heard about it made me envious. I mean, he actually managed to lock his guard into the bathroom when his guard prayed. So first of all, lockable bathroom. His guard separated himself from his gun, left his gun outside, and went into the bathroom to pray. And then there were keys. I mean, he could actually just show himself out of the compound. In our case, there were men with keys who came and went, and my guards were actually locked inside with me.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, when I thought about this, I thought, what am I coming up with in the next 5 minutes that you didn't come up with over 2.5 years?
Exactly.
The answer is nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing at all. Because even if you were the biggest wimp in the world, there's a level of courage that you muster when you decide that you're going to die on a mattress.
Yeah, out of sheer anger. Sure.
Yeah. Just some of the things that were so infuriating was just, and I know I keep revisiting this and I don't mean to sound negative, but just how dumb these guys were, right? Like they're ripping open all these tuna fish that were in the freezer looking for treasure when the fish were far more valuable than the wallet that they assumed was hidden inside the fish or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. They didn't rip them open, but they actually ordered the crew to take these enormous frozen tuna out of the freezer hold, and they were going to sort of check inside for, who knows, jewels or mobile phones that they didn't actually confiscate from the crew when they kidnapped them, when they captured the ship. It was crazy. But I think once there's this sort of group mania that takes hold of these guys, these pirates. And I think they just got it in their head that there was some other valuable thing on board, and there had to be, because they weren't going to get paid enough by the bosses or something like that. There was some weird mania going on, and they actually took this afternoon to pull up all the fish and go looking for jewels.
So asinine. Yeah, they beat up your friend to try to get him to admit he was Israeli, even though for the last, 8 months he was clearly not.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I had to be careful when the pirate boss asked me about that, actually, because they brought us both on shore from the ship for about 24 hours. And one thing they did during that period was torture my friend Rolly, one of the Seychelles. They strung him up from a branch by his feet, and while he was dangling there upside down, they beat him with a cane. And I said, "Why are you doing this?" to one of the top-ranking pirates who was there. And he said, "Well, we have found out that he's Israeli, and he won't admit that he's Israeli." I said, "But he's not Israeli." And then they said, "How do you know?" And the answer to that could not be, "Muhammad, I've been to Israel."
Right.
I know how Hebrew sounds. So I didn't say that, but I said he doesn't talk like an Israeli. And they just got these ideas in their heads, and either for their own convenience and profit, or because they really are that stupid, they hung on to him, and it had terrible consequences sometimes for the hostages.
Yeah, so frustrating. So you finally, spoiler alert, you didn't get off the ship when you jumped off, or you didn't get away when you jumped off the ship.
Yeah, I spent about half an hour in the water.
Right. Yeah. So what's going on here? I mean, you mentioned in the book, fear and desperation are forms of energy which convert to something powerful if you express them well. What does that mean?
It just means that when I leapt off the boat, I was happy. I had wanted to try to escape for so long that once I did, I was just gleeful. It was one of the best swims of my life. And that's because it was an emotionally true thing to do, even if it wasn't the most prudent.
So essentially, I'm imagining this in the movie is you flying in slow motion off the boat with a big grin on your face, right? With your legs and arms flailing in the air.
Well, no, I was terrified. I don't think I was grinning on my way. But once I was in the water, I'm like, wow, it's warm. It's kind of nice out here.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. To jump off a boat, like imagine the desperation where you're jumping off a boat off the coast of Africa with people who are probably, I would imagine, trying to shoot at you with rifles while you're swimming around. I don't know. What's going on then?
That was the big fear. I mean, that was one reason, obviously, I didn't do it for as long as I was thinking of it. I was worried that there would just be some sort of curtain of gunfire once I jumped. It turned out no Somali fired a shot. No one fired a shot. So I was in good shape that way. But there was also nobody to rescue. I expected that the ship, which was not in terrific condition, would just keep moving and that they wouldn't be able to turn it around. But they did something sort of half-assed. They didn't turn it around, but they let it come back towards me on this swell that I had chosen to sort of follow off the ship, and eventually would have run right over me. So I had to give myself up.
Now you're captive for over a year at this point. What's the negotiation that's happening? Because that seems painfully slow. It seems like a low ROI thing for them to do. Then again, all they're doing is wasting your life. They don't really care about that, right? They've got nothing better to do.
They didn't care. That was within the first year. All that with the ship happened within the first year, and in fact within the first 9 months. And as long as that seemed while I was a captive, the negotiations for my ransom didn't budge at all. So in other words, the pirates asked for $20 million up front, which is a completely ridiculous demand. But they hung on to it for most of that first year, and it didn't budge until after my escape attempt. I'm not sure I would have risked the escape attempt if negotiations had been underway. But I thought these guys are, I knew from phone calls that they were still stuck at 20 million. And I thought these guys are being so ridiculous that, it's worth a try.
Who's negotiating for you? Like, they're just calling your mom and freaking her out? What's happening on the phone?
Yep. And that was basically it. My mother heard about my kidnapping from the FBI, so they came to her door. And the FBI went to several other places, including the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, where I had a grant. And I'm also a German citizen, so German officials went to the Spiegel Online office where I worked in Berlin, and my relatives in Cologne. And everybody was ready for a phone call. Everyone had to guess, where the first phone call would come. And because the pirates had stolen my notes, the only phone number I knew was my mother's here in California. So I called Mom. And she was obviously terrified, but by then she'd been briefed by the FBI. So she got pretty good advice from them.
What was the advice? Just like, hey, don't start screaming and crying.
Yeah, keep your cool and don't act emotional. Don't give them the emotional upper hand. And my mother could do that. I mean, not every relative can do that, and that's one thing the agent said was that she was remarkable on the phone. She was obviously emotional, but when it came time to talk to a pirate, she could switch it off. So I don't think just anyone could have negotiated like that for a relative, but my mom was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that seems incredible. I can not imagine most people's moms doing that. And you didn't have a whole lot of hope. In fact, you even wrote, hope has become a psychological risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it became a problem. Like I said, the pirates kept trying to keep my hopes up and say, okay, Michael, you're going to get out in 2 weeks, or you're going to get out in a month. And I would believe them. At least in the first several months, I was stupid enough to believe them. And then a month would go by and I'm still a hostage. And you feel that much worse afterwards. The cycle is not just up and down. It's up and down with a downward trend. And your emotion just gets, the risk of a deep and suicidal depression was very real. So I realized that to save myself from that, I had to detach myself emotionally from the whole cycle, meaning no hope, but also not so much despair. And I managed to live without hope, after 2 years or something, I didn't think I was going to see my family and friends again. I thought that the likelihood I was going to die in Somalia was about 50%. Either in a military raid or just of some disease or by accident. The pirates, they try not to kill you on purpose, but sometimes they kill you by accident. So I just thought that at some point I'm not going to make it out, and I can't pin my hopes and my reasons for going on the idea that I'm going to see the people I love again. So I learned to live just from day to day.
How did you do that? How do you manage your sanity from day to day? Like, what advice would you give someone if they're in a situation right now where they think, I'm in this awful situation, nothing's working out in my life? Granted, they're probably not listening to this while being held hostage by Somali pirates, but they feel equally hopeless. What sort of advice would you give that person?
It's hard to say. It is a spiritual discipline. One thing that helped me was yoga. So yoga was also a physical thing, but it did help me sort of detach from that cycle. Every day that I could do it. It has to be part of your practice somehow. It has to be some part of your mind already. You can't just do it. You can't just start. You can start practicing, but you can't just sort of start. The other things that help, and I go into this a little bit in The Desert and the Sea, is that writing is also a form of detachment for me. And whenever I could have a notebook and a pen, I did much better emotionally. So those two things, yoga and writing, did it for me. But for someone else, it might be meditation. For someone else, it might be some other practice. I've heard that other captives just kept themselves alive by jogging once a day. But if I had started to run around my little concrete cell, I think I would have gotten shot.
Oh, really? They were that high on cot and alert that they would have just.
They wouldn't have wanted me. I mean, of course, I would have asked first, and they just would have said no. But they wouldn't have wanted me to do something that was potentially so unpredictable. I suppose every captive has a different set of circumstances, but I think it would have been too easy for me to dash out the door or something. So they wouldn't have wanted me to do something like that.
How did you finally get out of there? Tell us the story of how you were finally released.
Well, my mom talked them down. I mean, I have to say that the pirates blinked at the end, but still, there was a ransom that had to be paid of $1.6 million. And my mom had to scrape that together with contributions from family and friends and some magazines I'd worked for and that kind of thing. And the ransom was delivered in cash. I know that because I saw one plastic bag full of dollars. I'm not quite sure how it got there. Sometimes there's an airdrop or whatever. But once they had the money, I mean, this took an enormous amount of trust from my family's point of view. And once they had the money, they actually, in pretty short order, within a couple of hours, drove me out into the bush and gave me to some other Somalis, some middlemen, who then took me to the airport. And waiting for me there was a contracted pilot who turns out to be a really great guy named Derek. And he flew me out. He flew me away from Galkayo and over to Mogadishu. And from there, a U.S. Air Force plane landed and took me back to Nairobi.
How are you feeling when you're on the plane? Were you still like, oh, this is another... I don't even know how much hope I would even have left. I'd be like, who knows if I'm actually out of here. I don't know if I believe it.
Yeah, I didn't believe it at first. I mean, when the pirates told me, of course I didn't, because I'd heard that too many times. They said, Michael, you're going free. And I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. So, but one step at a time, I started to realize it was true. Once they handed me to another Somali, of course, I was afraid that the bag of money was like a deal to sell me to Al-Shabaab or something like that. And once that second Somali in the second car was not an Al-Shabaab member, and in fact could call my mom on his phone, I realized it was happening. And then once I got on the plane, I felt much better too. I mean, before the plane actually took off, all kinds of things could have gone wrong. So I didn't quite relax until we were airborne. And then once we were landed in Mogadishu, that was another stage. Once we were airborne again in the C-130, then I felt really good and really secure because, C-130, that's not going to crash, most likely.
Yeah, most likely. God, what a crazy saga that was. What was the hardest thing about readjusting to society when you got home?
By that point, I was not used to being with people who meant me well. So It was a little bit difficult to deal with people who loved me. I just having too many of them in the room at one time would have been overwhelming in the first few days, because I wasn't used to communicating with people except in the most sort of brutal way. A couple of words that didn't have any shades of meaning, and once I had to interpret what people were saying by all the other cues that we use from day to day just to communicate, it quickly became overwhelming to my mind. My brain was just not wired like that anymore. But I got used to it. I mean, I was also physically in very bad shape. And once I started to recover physically, my mind started to recover too. So I probably didn't have a party until 2 or 3 weeks after I got out. But once I did, it was good.
So you started going to the gym and stuff like that to get your body back in shape, and that helped you recover mentally?
Almost right away. Yeah. Yoga, going to the gym. And one of the doctors I saw said you have a protein deficiency. So I started to rectify that right away.
Yeah, surprise. You ate freaking spaghetti with potato juice on it for 2 years.
And occasional camel and a goat once a week or something. So no, my body was actually breaking down as a result of that. And once I rectified it, lots of things started to go much better. It still took a year to recover physically, I think, and mentally, I don't make any assumptions. I just assume I'm still potentially insane. But one day at a time, and the body and mind both know how to recover.
Yeah. What happened to the pirates?
That's a good question. So 2 days after I left, there was a little dispute over my ransom money, and two halves of the pirate gang got together to discuss it and argue about it, and gunfire broke out. So 5 top-ranking pirates lost their lives. They killed each other.
So, because it ticks me off that you had to pay a ransom, I'm sure it pisses you off too. But in a way, it's kind of like, well, Had you just escaped, they would have been doing this to somebody else. But since you paid, they're dead.
That's exactly right. And one constant fear while I was there is that I was going to get rescued militarily, which would have been, the right and moral thing to do, I suppose, rather than paying a criminal gang. But then there's a risk I would get killed. There's a risk an operator would get killed. And for sure, my guards, who I'd gotten to know, would have gotten killed. And these are the lowest ranking guys. These are not the guys who richly deserve to catch it. As it turns out, 3, if not 5, of the guys who richly deserved it killed each other. I can't complain about that particular ending.
Yeah, I do find it total BS that nobody rescued you. Aren't you mad about that? Come on.
I'm not mad. I've actually had operators come up afterwards. I mean, people who were there, Americans and paying attention, and who would have been sent in, actually say, "I'm sorry, we couldn't get you." But these decisions are made further up the line, including by the president. And I don't want anyone to risk their lives if everything, including all the intelligence, is not in order. And I think basically guys who are trained to do this don't mind as long as the intelligence is in order. But if it's not, it's not. If the stars don't align, forget it. It's not worth it. And I would rather be a hostage under a cautious president than under a reckless one.
Yeah, interesting. What do you mean by that?
I'll just leave that there.
Okay, gotcha. The FBI agent in Berlin, he admitted, I was looking at photos of you with you had this like brightly colored sheet or something.
Yeah, no, that was right when I got on the C-130 in Mogadishu. There was an FBI agent, normally based in New York, who said, "I've been looking at that thing for a couple of years," and it was a bright pink blanket, which I think can be seen in a couple of pictures of me. And he didn't have to say any more than that. I said, "That's good to hear." It was confirmation that I was actually being watched.
I don't know if I'd be like, "That's good to hear." I'd be like, "Oh, thanks. You knew exactly where I was for coming." Yeah. Like, where the hell were you for 2.5 years?
Well, I mean, those feelings went through me, and I'm honest about that in the book. But once everything was over, I'm not going to waste time regretting the way they happened, especially because the way they happened could not have been much better in terms of what happened to the pirate gang.
Yeah.
And by the way, the FBI can't, they can't order, the FBI doesn't rank that high. They can't order a military rescue. So. Yeah,
that's true. Do you ever wake up in a cold sweat in your house and think you're still in Somalia?
That happened within the first year. Yeah, I had a few bad dreams in the first year or so.
That must have been awesome, though. Like, I thought it was really good when I woke up early for school and it turned out it was Christmas. This is that feeling times a million, right?
Times a million, exactly. And it was the reverse of waking up almost every night in Somalia and finding that I wasn't, off wherever I was dreaming, but actually back in Somalia. So the reverse of that was actually very healthy.
Yeah, I would imagine. I mean, I still, even to this day, have dreams where, like, I'm in Thailand and somebody put a kilo of cocaine in my luggage. And I'm like, no, how did this happen? Oh, I'm in my house. Yeah, times a million, though, because you were actually there. This was actually happening to you over a long period of time. And like you said, you had the reverse going on.
Yeah.
Do you ever think about what you do differently in the moment of capture, knowing what you would go through over the next 2.5 years? I had this guest a while ago, my friend Gavin DeBecker, who, by the way, listeners, is coming back. And one of the things he taught on Oprah in the 90s that I remember that helped me get away from my would-be abductors with the taxi thing was never go to the secondary location, which is stand and fight where you are, because when they finally take you to the boat or the thatch hut with a mattress in it, that's where no one's coming to get you. Would you fight at the technical and just get shot thinking, screw it, I'm not dealing with this?
No, I'm glad I didn't get killed.
Of course.
I'm also, I think in hindsight, resisting was probably bad because it resulted in broken glasses. And so if I had not had my glasses broken in the dust, I would not have been blind for 2 years and 8 months. So that was a problem. And that was not necessarily a foreseeable problem, but maybe it will be for someone else. Once it happened, I just wanted to rewind my entire life and just decide not to go to Somalia. I mean, that happened in the first few seconds, but that was not possible either.
Did anything positive come out of this in your mind after all of the thing, after this is all tallied up and all the calculations are done? Is there a net positive?
Well, the effects on my own, I mean, I lost a good chunk of my life in Somalia, but the effects on my own mental focus, I think, were positive. The other thing that is positive is, some friends of mine have been through horrible sort of bouts of disease. And one friend, while I was in Somalia, said, well, if Mike can survive Somalia, I can get through this, bout of cancer. And she did. Having that on people's minds is not a bad thing. And ultimately, the detrimental effect it had on the pirate gang was also, I think, a good thing. It could have turned out any other way, but I think in the end, the results of my case helped put most of this pirate gang out of business, and they're probably working on something else illicit, but probably not capturing hostages.
That's good. Yeah, because it was so long, drawn out, and then at the end of the day, 3 out of the 5 guys who are supposed to share in the profits have a hole in their head and are...
Yeah, five were killed. 3 of them were absolutely top bosses. 2 were a little bit peripheral, but top-ranking guys, not low-ranking guards. So that's going to have an effect on an organized crime gang.
Yeah, wow. That is interesting. You mentioned that it had an effect on your focus. What do you mean by that?
I just mean, what I described about living without hope is, you have to focus on something else, and that's a continuing benefit, I think.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's beyond interesting. It's terrible that had to happen to you, of course, but I will say that the way you wrote about it was highly interesting. You can sort of taste the hairy boiled goat or whatever. The story is written quite well. Are you still interested in Somali piracy, or do you just think, ugh, I've had enough, I never want to hear about this again, after this book is done, I'm over it?
Well, I'm not going back to Somalia.
Of course.
Piracy is still interesting as a subject to me, but I'm not going to risk myself again for another similar story. I'll find other ways to write about it, and I have plenty of other things to write about, too.
Are you afraid to travel at all now, or are you kind of like, I'm not going to New York, it's dangerous over there, or is it like,
no, I love
New
York. Are you kidding?
Okay.
I love the subway.
Yeah.
But no, my mom says I need a visa from her before I go to any dangerous countries now.
Yeah, she wants to be there to protect you next time, right?
No, she wants to cancel my visa and deny me No, I will still travel. I can still think of a couple of other good book ideas that will involve, leaving the parts of the world that I know very well. But I don't need to go to dangerous parts of the world. That's not what my career is based on, and it was never about seeking thrills or anything like that. So I don't need to go to a war zone anytime soon, but there are certainly other things to write about.
Michael Scott Moore, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jordan.